Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze with the Conscious Resistance Network. And today we're going to pick up a conversation I had with journalist Tim Hinchliffe about, actually I think more than a year ago. We're going to pick up where we left off because the agendas we talked about back in late 2021, as most of you will be familiar with, things like digital IDs, social credit scores, the rise of artificial intelligence, these things have only become more prevalent and I would say even more of a threat to privacy and to liberty in general in our world today. And Tim is doing some great work on this. We're going to talk particularly about some recent efforts by the United Nations and the Gates Foundation to push even further into this digital identity realm. And to enlighten us on that, we're going to have Tim join us today. So please welcome Tim. How are you doing, brother?
Doing great, thanks. How you doing, Derek?
I'm doing good. Just, as I said, kind of we're continuing the fight, right? Every day, however we can, trying to report on this. And I will remind everybody, just in case you haven't heard of Tim's work, which I highly, highly recommend. We actually, as I said, spoke back in, I think it was all the way back in December of 2021, Understanding the Great Narrative and the Collective Strength Simulation, where we were talking about those topics, which I still think are relevant right now, and I encourage people to go back and check that out. But today, what we're going to be focusing on is some reporting you've done here, Tim, at your site, The Sociable, sociable.co, which will be linked below. You have this one report from late October. The United Nations Gates Foundation 50 in 5 campaign aims to roll out digital public infrastructure. We'll talk about that term too, DPI now becoming a new acronym popping up, in 50 countries. And then just most recently, 50 in 5 DPI campaign launches to accelerate digital ID payments and data sharing among 50 countries within 5 years. So go ahead and just set the stage for us. What is the 50 in 5? When did it get announced? Is it already happening? And what are the goals of this?
Okay, so 50 and 5, this is something I just came across. I saw that the UN had put out a tweet on October 25th. I saw the tweet on October 27th, and that's when I started to cover it and look into it. So 50 and 5 is a campaign to get 50 countries to develop and launch at least one aspect, one component of their digital public infrastructure, DPI. Now, DPI has three components. They call this, the UN calls this a civic technology stack. And those three components are digital ID, some form of digital payment system, and then real-time data exchanges between public and private entities. So the event, it officially launched on November 8th, the 50 and 5 campaign, and they have already announced 11 countries that have are the first mover countries, they call them. Those countries are Guatemala, Norway, Estonia, Moldova, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Togo, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Singapore. So those are the 11 first countries. They're looking to get up to at least 50 in the next 5 years by 2028. And so, yeah, they're doing this all in the name of financial inclusion, improved healthcare, and all these benefits for society. But in the end, what I see is just another way of getting more information and on people, and to control movement, control behaviors. And this is just what we've seen for the past few years. Except now, they don't actually need a crisis to kind of bring all these things together. Now they're just saying this is just a public good. They're not saying like, oh, we need digital ID for climate refugees right now, or we don't need digital ID for vaccine passports and stuff. But these things can all be added on later on. So you can get like central bank digital currencies, carbon credits, carbon allowances, and things like that. So it's just a continuation of what's been going on for years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the first important point is, of course, we're not necessarily talking about anything brand new. Anybody who's been paying attention to my work or your work is aware that digital identities have been rolling out. And as you mentioned, either under the guise of fighting climate change, let track your carbon credits and things like that, or of course the immunity/vaccine passports that we've seen the last few years. Those were just a step in this direction. And I've been talking about and writing articles and doing videos for a while now, and trying to encourage people to look at the digital identity as a human rights scam, because this is of course being promoted through the SDGs, that we just need to get all the people, like in many of the countries you named in Africa and the global south, we need to get them on bank accounts and digital identities so that they can join the modern world and it'll help them and all these kinds of things. But it is very much just an effort to track and trace all of society as we know it. So I'm not surprised to see kind of a rebranding almost. It's still digital identities, but now they're like, it's digital public infrastructure, DPI, right? We'll talk more about that. But I don't know, I think you have seen it as well. The reason this also isn't too surprising for me is because back in the summer and then just back here in September, the United Nations and particularly Antonio Guterres was basically crying, saying we're halfway to the SDGs and we're falling short, we're not going to meet our goals, which I think, of course, is kind of reverse engineering, reverse psychology, just trying to encourage people like we need to put more effort, more into these goals, but also maybe a true acknowledgement that the public at large isn't really kind of going along with the plan, so to speak. And so I'm not surprised to see things like 50 and 5 being announced. And this event, as we just saw on screen, the launch event was just a couple of days ago, right? So I'm not surprised because the UN is saying we have to accelerate the push towards SDGs if we're going to accomplish this in the next 6.5 years, right? So do you think this DPI is kind of part of that, like part of the renewed push, like trying to reinvigorate people, especially with a goal like 50 in 5 years? That seems like an acceleration on my part.
Yeah, definitely. That word acceleration is key to this. Even just was it last week, the World Economic Forum came out with a report saying the exact same thing about what the UN was saying is how that they're not reaching these sustainable development goals soon enough. So now they're saying, well, stop thinking long-term stuff. Do what you can now, and just implement whatever little piece you can right now. And it's the same people, same groups, same organizations, just in a whole circular like inbreeding of people funding one group, funding another group. So take this 50 and 5 campaign. So it's officially a collaboration between the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the United Nations Development Program, the Digital Public Good Alliance, the Center for Digital Public Infrastructure, and Co-Develop. Now, if you actually look at who's behind each of these groups, it's all the same people. So the Center for Digital Public Infrastructure, that's backed by Co-Develop, which is one of the people in 50 and 5, and another group called Nilekani Philanthropies. Now, Nilekani, that's from Nandan Nilekani, and he's the co-founder of Infosys, and also the guy behind India's Aadhaar digital ID system. And he said back in spring, in April this year at the IMF spring meetings, he said that digital public infrastructure, what we need to do to implement that are the 3 tools of the new world, he called them. Those were bank account, smartphone, and what are those 3 tools? Bank card, smartphone.
Would it be CBDCs?
Bank account, smartphone, and yeah, I just lost the thing. Oh, here it is. Everybody should have a digital ID. Everybody should have a bank account. Everybody should have a smartphone. Those are what he said back then. So that's Nilekani. So getting back to the people behind the 50 and 5, Co-Develop was founded by the Rockefeller Foundation, along with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and again, Nilekani Philanthropies, and also the Omidyar Network, which is all about digital ID. The Omidyar Network is the funder of MOSIP. MOSIP is a Gates Foundation funded platform that helps governments and other organizations implement digital ID. It stands for Modular Open Source Identity Platform. And then you have the Digital Public Good Alliance, which lists Gates Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and its roadmap, showcasing all these DPI activities. So it's really, the messaging is coming from just a small group of, they're big groups, but just a tight-knit group of big groups all pushing for the same thing. And they know how, we're talking about the acceleration of things and how people aren't really buying into everything, but they know how unpopular their ideas are. They know how unpopular agendas. Just go out on Twitter, if you look at if they allow comments, wow, there's a lot of backlash there. And that's why many of them just shut them off altogether because, man, no one's buying this.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, it's not a large number of organizations. It never really has been. I mean, they like to create foundations, and they have so many acronyms, and they have so many different agreements. And especially when it comes to the UN, like I sent you an interview I did last week with Jakob Northengard of Sweden, talking about another agreement, the Summit Financing Pact of the Future. And I know it's a lot for people to keep up, so I want to encourage anybody who's listening who's already maybe glazed over in the eyes of DPI and this and this, like just understand that it is many of the same players. They might come in different names, but as Tim was just pointing out there, when you track back who's funding who, it does go back often to the Rockefeller Foundation, to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Of course, they're not the only ones, but they definitely are funding a lot of these different groups and organizations that if you just were to look at them and kind of put them all out there, you wouldn't imagine that all these different groups were actually interconnected and being funded by the same people, and then well, they're in partnership with these groups. It creates this, in my view, this kind of false appearance that these ideas are much more popular than they really are, when in fact it's just this kind of small, the word cabal I think maybe is useful here. And so I have on screen here for those who are looking, just to reiterate what Tim just said, 50 and 5 is a country-led advocacy campaign in collaboration with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Center for Digital Public Infrastructure, co-develop Digital Public Goods Alliance and the United Nations Development Program, and is supported by GovStack, the Inter-American Development Bank, and UNICEF. So a lot of kind of globalist players there. Have you come across, Tim, like in you're looking at, now we're seeing this use of DPI. I think anybody who tries to look out for this propaganda should probably keep your eyes and ears trained to this now. When you hear DPI, it's going to be related to digital public goods, but more specifically to digital identities and similar things like this. But do you see, is this bigger than just digital ID when they're talking about digital public infrastructure? Like, is this, as you said, like helping people get the bank account, helping people get the smartphone, or is it just on the digital ID front?
So digital public infrastructure, it's much bigger than digital identity. Yes, that's a main component. That's one of the three components, but also is the payment system. And there's literature coming out from especially the G20 and the B20, how that's going to be central bank digital currencies. So yes, of course, everything's tied into the digital ID and a digital wallet. And the European Parliament, was it last week, they're saying that they are going to introduce that bill in there. They're pushing that through for digital ID. But this digital public infrastructure is more than the digital ID. It's got the payment systems, and it's also, I believe, tied into smart cities as well. So think about those ultra low emission zones. Those are for your car and stuff. But you can imagine like limiting movement anytime that there's a perceived crisis, or if they say the climate is going wrong, we have to implement this rule, this law, then that will be pegged to your digital ID, which affects your what you can do with your programmable money. And then the other part of it is the data exchange. So it's not just using these tools for you, the individual that has this ID or is using the money, this programmable money, but it's also for the institutions and governments to share all this data about you with each other. So anytime just with a flick of a switch, it can just be shut off, or just even last week or a couple weeks ago, IATA, the International Aviation Travel Association, which represents like 300 of the major airlines, they just piloted a digital identity-based solution, which takes the passenger from how to pay with digital ID, how to book a flight, and how to do all of this. And they said the goal was always to get people on this biometric digital ID system. So it's converging in so many different ways. So it's the digital ID, it's the payments, and then the data sharing. And then what I see this all coming to is just a system of social credit. That they want to be apps, the everything app. Even at the 50 and 5 launch, the representative from Moldova, I think it was the minister of, who was it? The Deputy Prime Minister of Moldova, saying that they're committed to enhancing and establishing and they're modeling their after Ukraine Dia app. So they want it to be a one-stop shop.
We're talking about the 50 and 5 event that just took place November 8th. They just officially launched it, as you reported on here. And you talked about, that statement there from the one official there. Is there any other big takeaways? Was this just kind of the first step, or was there anything big that you saw announced in terms of discussions or other speakers on the official launch? Or was this really just like their first kind of kickoff, letting it known that they're here and they're starting to work on this?
Yeah, well, there's a couple in the article that you have pulled up that there's a couple of quotes. Another one, which I think is really important, that says a lot to me, that from Moldova, is that what do they say? Is that it's over the next 5 years, we are committed to enhancing and establishing key DPI components, the payment system, the digital signature, the digital identity. All of those components are already available in Moldova. They are currently being in a permanent state of evolution. So that just means they're going to keep adding more features or functions to it, and it's going to keep growing and growing and growing. So whatever there's on now, they have there now, but just imagine that any situation in the future can arise, and they'll just say, oh, now we're going to add this to it, and now we're going to restrict this, and now we're going to add this so you can't move here, and now we're going to add this. And it just keeps on expanding. It reminds me of how European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde, we all know her, she keeps saying about the digital euro, which is CBDC, that cash will always be available. I don't believe her for 1 second, because once you reach a certain threshold of adoptability of certain people, a number of people who've adopted it, they could just say like, well, there's no point. And things like this are already happening in places like, I believe, Australia. You can't get, it's harder to get cash out of, banks aren't taking cash, and elsewhere in the world, ATMs, branches are closing. So they're just trying to slowly do away with cash, just on its own, just trying to phase it out and just try to prop up something that they say is more convenient. But in the end, just like what this Moldova guy is saying, we're in a permanent state of evolution. So this is never ending. And then another thing from the same article is that Sina Lawson from Togo, she's the Minister of Digital Economy and Transformation of Togo. She was part of the first time I ever covered DPI was actually 2 years ago. I believe it was for the World Economic Forum Sustainable Development Impact Summit 2021. And she was on that panel bragging about Togo and using their digital ID system. What the first thing they did was to give out a UBI, Universal Basic Income, to I think it was $34 million to a large swath of their population. And she said that's how it started. That's how their their DPI road started. And then right from there, they went into vaccine passports. So this is what I'm saying, like, we'll start with one thing, but then we'll just add on this other thing and keep on adding on. And this is going to keep, and this, I believe, will extend out to smart cities and beyond. And then smart cities will share data with other smart cities, and just, it creates this grid of total track and trace and control.
Yeah, absolutely. And you did a good kind of trajectory, showing that trajectory of, well, we'll start off with it's just going to be a payment system to help people. And as you wrote here in the article, quoting from Lawson, she said that they distributed $34 million to the most vulnerable people, and they received it directly through their cell phone. So again, reinforcing that the smartphone is going to be a key part of them setting up these digital payment, digital infrastructure systems. And then, as you mentioned as well, COVID set up the perfect example. Well, people are already accepting things through an app on their phone. Well, let's make that a digital COVID certificate next, right? And the other thing that struck me when you were talking about the Moldova guy, the deputy prime minister, is how he's kind of describing, at least the way I'm interpreting it as I'm reading this, it's that kind of all-in-one. It sounds like a WeChat. It sounds like what Elon Musk wants to do with X. Like he said, like you mentioned, he said it's kind of perpetually and it's evolving all the time. And he mentioned here, over the next 5 years, we want to establish the payment system, the digital signature, the digital identity. And then he says a one-stop shop for citizen to government and business to government interaction without any hassle, bureaucracy, or paper on, of course, they promise. So to me, it's like this is just more evidence that their whole goal, or at least one of their big goals, is to move further towards these all-in-one. the one app to rule them all, whether it's going to be X or it's going to be WeChat, like a private version through Elon Musk or something, if you consider that private when he gets so much funding from the government, or a government run app like the Ukraine one they mentioned there, or what they're working on in these other nations, right? I mean, that to me is the big picture, and we've already touched on, like, that's going to include your corporate credit score, it's going to include your bank transactions and history, it'll probably have your social media and your friends and family to make it super convenient. And it's going to be hard to, I can already imagine just like trying to appeal to friends and family, like, please don't sign up for this app. Like, I know it's super convenient because it's going to be trendy and everybody's going to be downloading it, like we already see with things that are, becoming popular but are also very invasive. The masses will just gobble them up and sign up and not even think for 2 seconds about what it means for their privacy or their future. But could you speak to that a little bit, just this bigger picture of whether we're talking X, whether we're talking WeChat, but this idea that there is going to be the everything in one app that will, of course, just sacrifice all of our privacy?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. The convenience part is going to be what sells it, and that's the toughest part. But what friends and family, people should know is that all they're doing is cataloging you, turning you into a barcode, and then it's all for manipulating and your behaviors, whether that's by reward or coercion or force. If you don't agree with something, if you say the wrong thing on social media under hate speech laws or whatever, it doesn't even have to be a law. That's what public-private partnerships do, is they skirt around things. So what the government can't do, the private sector can do. What the private sector can't do, the government can do. So that's that unholy union there of the merger of corporation and state. And so when those things are combined, it's total control over your life. It's all it is going to take away more and more freedom. And there's going to be people who are going to accept that. Some people are just going to love, sitting back in the metaverse and in their 15-minute smart cities, with everything piped into them on a universal basic income. But for others, the fight for freedom, the drive is within them. So if you just, picture a future of just complete digital control over what you do, what you say, where you go, what you spend your programmable money on or not, where you can spend it, all of that's all coming. That's all been planned. That's all being talked about openly.
Absolutely. They have laid out the plans in front of us. Well, one other question, Tim, that might be interesting to some of the listeners is both of us spend time in Latin American countries. My listeners know that I spend time in Mexico, and you're in another nation as well. You can share if you like. But is this something that you are starting to see creep into the area where you're at? Because I know there are many people listening, and I've been one of the people saying that Latin America, Mexico, and other countries are really behind in terms of the technology in some cases. But at the same time, in Mexico, I absolutely see the efforts to push Agenda 2030. We saw it very subtly in COVID because Mexico was much more safe during COVID than other places. We didn't have lockdowns and things like that. But every now and then in a random city, you might see them trying to get people comfortable with the thermal face scanners and things like that. And since most people in Mexico have no awareness of these privacy tools or even just, they don't fully understand it yet, they're happy to just, okay, I'll line up and look at the thing if I can get into the mall. So it wasn't widespread, but we did see some small examples, and I worry that there's not enough of a consciousness to resist it, that it's not there yet, but it will come if the people do not get educated and learn how to resist these technologies. Sooner or later, they will end up in a place like the United States or the UK and other Western nations are, with facial recognition cameras, CCTVs, etc. So do you have any experience or any thoughts on that, like what it's like in your area and how you think Latin America in general, broadly, is taking this agenda?
Yeah, well, I make no secret of it. I've been living here in Colombia for the past 9 years, up in the mountains outside of Medellin, Colombia. And as far as these measures go, people here, that, in my experience, they're completely oblivious. It's not, they've had 50 years of civil war. They've got their own socialist president now. They got they've got other priorities, I guess, or they're thinking about other things. But I will say that entering and leaving the country at the airports, they're trying to get people to sign up for biometric registration, going through customs and things like that. I saw a couple people use it when I've gone through the airports, but I haven't seen much adoption in it. As far as like restrictions went, like during during lockdowns, that was harsh. I mean, it seemed like Colombia and Mexico were like one of the two freest countries for the longest time, but it was a couple of months, no, 2 weeks before Christmas, a couple of years ago, all of a sudden, Colombia decided to have the mandatory vaccine to enter the country. And then, so I got stuck here. I couldn't leave the country for Christmas. And that sucked because, I mean, that was my nephew's last Christmas because he had leukemia and he passed away a couple weeks just after that. So I didn't get to see him for that last one. Other than that, the Colombian government is rolling out something called the Cédula Digital, which is a digital ID. So I don't know what the adoption's been on that, but they're pushing forward towards that. That's what I've seen. But if you talking with people around here, they just think like, "Oh, are you talking about Illuminati?" And that's about as far as I've been able to get with it.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting, man, because so I spend part of the year in Houston and then down in Mexico and can definitely, you know, I'm in Houston right now, so major 4 million plus mega city that is already in the process of becoming a smart city. They've just launched driverless cars a couple of weeks ago, and then they had to cancel them because they were causing traffic jams. And they just, you know, they have digital billboards around the city. They've got the 5G, like it's happening, like it's full in motion. And I don't know if there's any stopping it in a place like here. But even with all that going on, the average Houstonian, I would say, is just completely clueless. Like has no idea that the city's even making moves. Like, oh, they're like, oh, look, there's a digital billboard that popped up on my block, and that's about it. They kind of notice the kiosks and they don't notice the cameras on them and that they're listening to them all the time or recording all the time, but they notice that they tell them when it's time to get their new Pfizer update booster or whatever, like stuff like that. So they're also doubling as propaganda machines in addition to surveillance devices and stuff. But with all that said, I mean, it doesn't seem like there's much awareness of this, and even less, I would say. I mean, we're hosting our event, The Greater Reset in Mexico. We're trying to build a movement out there, not just of expats and foreigners, but working with the local population and trying to educate and inform and work with other activists who do know what's going on. And there are some, but by and large, I think that Mexicans, again, generally speaking, not everybody, are probably going to, in the coming years, walk right into this same stuff that we see everybody else walking into, because the sad thing about kind of living south of the U.S. is there are some benefits to being in the U.S. as opposed to Mexico on some areas, and a lot of people look to the U.S. as kind of like, you know, that light on the hill. Either they want to get to the U.S. to start a better life, which is not everybody, but some people. But even if they don't want to move to the U.S., they follow U.S. celebrities. They keep up with U.S. things going on, and so that means they also follow the trends. Like they want to get the latest iPhone if they can afford it. They want to get the latest gadget of this thing or that thing, right? So you still see some of the kind of American consumerism coming down. And I think, unfortunately, that American consumerism and that sort of wanting to keep up and have the latest everything is going to play into people buying into digital identities and all this other stuff going on.
Well, I will say about here, at least in rural Colombia, is that, it's so far removed, like apart from the major cities, like there's not a whole lot of infrastructure out here. And people pay with cash all the time. So it's kind of life goes on, life as normal without all this technocratic stuff, because people out here are paying with cash. They're living in the mountains and farming, and just trying to raise a family and things. So, but the thing is, yeah, the creep, the technocratic creep is coming in, and it's going to affect everybody. So, but yeah, it's not on people's minds. But I'm just going to say that out here in rural Colombia, it's almost, like not listening to the news is kind of healthy.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably, it seems like that's probably a lot of places, because I hear the same thing in the U.S., right? Again, I'm in the big city of Houston, but if you go 45 minutes away to a little more rural areas, they're not following, they're like, smart city, what? I'm not paying attention. And it's the same thing in Mexico. In Morelia, yeah, it's a city. It's they even have, the World Economic Forum even has one of their hubs there, actually. But 45 minutes away in a different part of the city, in a different part of the mountain, the people there have no idea about any of this stuff. And many people, this is, I think, what helped during COVID, is that so many of the people weren't like following the propaganda with a fine-tooth comb. They kind of vaguely knew something about COVID or people were getting sick. So there are some benefits, which to me, for anybody listening, it reiterates the need to not put all of your eggs in the stay in the city basket, because, you know, I'm a city guy. I love the city. I love the country too. But I just know that I really don't think I can, you know, put all my, lay my roots here in Houston any further, knowing what's coming, right? I mean, I think it would be ignorant to do so. So I just want to invite everybody to think that, just a little food for that thought. But Tim, anything else you want to wrap up with in terms of DPI, in terms of 50 and 5 that we didn't touch on that you'd like to leave everybody with?
Well, no, it's just that know that it's all the same people putting the same stuff out. It's an agenda been going on for a long time. First, you know, it's trying to exploit crises. Now they're saying it's just for good, and it's like as you pointed out, just don't believe it. They're they don't have nearly the amount of support that they want you to think to. And there's a lot more of you than there than, so you have all the time.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today, Tim. I will put all the links below to both of your articles and our previous interview if anybody wants to get caught up on that, from the great narrative and all the stuff we were talking about 2 years ago. I wish I could say things have gotten better since our last conversation almost 2 years ago, but unfortunately that's not the cards we have been dealt. Nevertheless, though, we continue on, and I want to invite everybody hearing this to follow Tim's work over at sociable.co, because Tim, the reason I wanted to have you on is because, and I respect your work, is because I feel like you, and I can name maybe a handful of other people, including myself, I'd say probably less than 10, who are actively kind of following these various meetings, and it's a lot to keep up with. So, you know, I always feel comfortable knowing if I miss something, like in the case of the 50 and 5, well, surely Tim's picked it up and he's reported on it, or somebody else in our circles. So I appreciate you staying on these matters as important as they are, and informing people where we can. Hopefully, everybody, you guys got some more information and some more awareness of what's going on. The digital identity issue is not going away. The digital ID as a human right is a scam, and it's not going away. And you're going to hear this term digital public infrastructure, digital goods, much more as we're moving forward. You're going to hear governments and private actors like Elon Musk calling for apps that have everything in one, that's going to be sold to you as convenient, it's going to be entertaining, it's going to be just so easy, it'll be touch-free, all these things that they can, but we must resist it where we can. And I think, just to reiterate and come full circle to what Tim said earlier, remember that this is a payment system, it's based on your smartphone, and there's an economic aspect. We know the CBDC, so you need to start, I recommend everybody hearing this, start having conversations with your family, yourself, your loved ones about those systems, and what does that mean going forward? You know, what does that mean for your children having smartphones when your kids want to download the new Everything in One app, right? Are you willing to just let them do so and give away all their privacy? These are conversations we need to be having. This is the whole reason that we have these conversations, not just to tell you guys how bad things are getting, but to hopefully inspire you to take action. And whether that action is a conversation with your friends and family to say, what are we going to do when they roll out these things? How are we going to respond? What steps are we taking now? You know, or just to be aware so that when it does come, you are not swept in the hysteria. But thank you again, Tim, for joining us today. I appreciate your work, as always. And everyone, please subscribe, follow Tim, and as always, remember, you are powerful,